work for them and tells them.
Give some questions. You want me just to look at you, essentially?
The opening line is the only thing that we look into the camera, and I just try to forget about it as much as I can in conversation.
Yeah. Well, it's easy with no audience.
Yes, yes. And I think for me, I think you need a lot of experience before the camera. We had former Senator Eugene McCarthy on a while back. He was wonderful. I mean, he really knew how to work the camera to his advantage. Hello, I'm Eileen Kavanaugh from Hennepin County Library Program Office. Our guest today is Charlotte MacLeod, author of over 35 mysteries, all of them delightful and entertaining. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Thank you. It's our pleasure. Your new book, Vain Pursuit, is part of the Peter Shandy series. The series is kind of a spoof on mysteries. Is that something you do for comic relief, or do you like to poke fun at the genre?
It's just what I do. It's the way I write. I don't no, it's not poking fun at the genre, because after all, that's my living, and I take myself very seriously as a mystery writer, even though I don't take my characters as seriously as some other writers do.
But this series does seem to be in a little different vein, for instance, than the New Brunswick series with Janet Wadman or the Sarah Kelling series that's set in Boston. It just has a different tongue-in-cheek flavor to it.
That's perfectly true. As a matter of fact, I do 4 different series, and they all, I seem to shift into a different gear for each one. It's quite interesting to me. I have a, well, you know, writing is complete involvement. You're hearing the voices, you're seeing the action, you're thinking the way the characters are thinking, and of course these are all different people from different backgrounds with different ideas, different approaches, and you just have to, when I'm being Peter Shandy, for example, I'm a very different person from when I'm being Janet Wadman or Sarah Kelling or Max Bitterson. You really do, just as an actor or an actress has to keep in the role of the that he or she is portraying, you do that. And
so do you keep 4 different notebooks to keep everything straight?
No. No, I rely on my memory, which is often a mistake. No, it's as I said, you shift into a different ambience, and you don't get mixed up because you can't. It's just as though if you went to a family reunion and chatted with your relatives, and then went to a librarian's convention and chatted with your colleagues, you would say different things in different ways. You would be a different person. You're not somebody's little beloved niece. You're a professional woman. You know, you're who you are in each situation. We all have many identities, you know.
That's a good comparison. Certainly true. Yeah. Yes. I wanted to talk a little bit about Helen Marsh, Peter Shandy's wife.
Yes, beloved of all librarians.
Yes, she is a librarian, and she's a strong woman, and she's persistent, and she's accurate.
Yes.
And I'm hoping you're going to say that you based her on an actual librarian you know and love.
Well, I never actually base anybody on one real person, but I have had associations with librarians from not only having been a haunter of the library when I was a kid, but I worked in the library in Weymouth, Massachusetts when I was going to art school, and I have been a library trustee and a president of Friends of the Library, and really had a great deal of association with librarians. So I would say Helen is a composite of all the librarians I've known and loved, and also I did feel rather strongly that there are a few stereotypes about librarians which certainly need to be exploded. Helen is she's not only a very competent librarian, in fact she's quite brilliant, as you know, she has her PhD and so on, but she's also a charming and attractive woman, and obviously quite an exciting one, because Peter meets her and marries her in the very first, well, he meets her and proposes to her in the very first book of the series, and obviously they have a very satisfying life together from then on, with many adventures, and I think that librarians are pretty exciting people by and large, and this is a point that I enjoy making.
Wonderful. And she doesn't wear Cuban heels, and she doesn't have a bun, and I think
no, well, she
great.
may someday. If she feels like it, she will. But as a matter of fact, you notice in Vain Pursuit she has new pink sneakers now.
Yes.
I mean, that's not so stuffy after all, is it?
Not at all. It's wonderful. And you are a bird watcher, and so is Peter Shandy.
Yes.
And I was wondering if that is a way of bringing that piece of expertise into your work and making use of it, or whether all authors find that something autobiographical surfaces in their work.
I think autobiographical things are constantly surfacing because, for one thing, I think every character has a little bit of you in it. Just as if a mother had 20 children, they might all have different personalities, but they would all be in some way, there would be an underlying little bit of the family relationship in whatever comes of their lives. And yes, I'm a bird watcher, and well, for one thing, after all, with a name like MacLeod, you can't expect me to waste anything. I, like many writers, I have a real ragbag mind. I love all sorts of different, I'm always getting involved in something or other. If a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly as far as I'm concerned, as long as you're enjoying it. But and you also, I read omnivorously. I love to read. If I get faint if I get too far away from a book. And this, I think, is true of many writers. You'd be surprised what good customers they are of libraries and bookstores. And you get all this information, and I retain it. I can remember things that happened when I was less than 2 years old. Never anything, I mean, I can't remember whether I've paid my income tax or where I put my glasses. I've got 6 pairs of glasses, and frequently I can't find any of them. But you know, some little thing about the way someone turned his head and reached down and picked up a horse chestnut or something 40 years ago under some peculiar circumstance, that I can remember, and that I would use. Just the little, you're always detecting, you might say. You're always watching, always storing up the way you're holding your hand, or anything can be grist for your mill. That's why I never can remember all this other stuff. You see, I've got my mind so full of all this bits and pieces that I'm going to use
like
someday.
A squirrel storing nuts for the winter.
Exactly, yes.
Is Catriona McBogle, who lives in Maine and writes goofy books and autobiographical type?
Well, I must admit, when I say that I have never patterned anybody after anybody, it just so happens that her house is pretty much the house that I now live in, and while I am not tall and redheaded, except, well, my little turban doesn't count, she has many of my characteristics. I figured if I ever did pattern anybody after anybody, it would be okay to pattern her after myself.
I couldn't miss the name, which seemed quite similar.
Yes, yes.
And the description. How about the whale watching jaunt in vain pursuit? Did this evolve from your move from Sudbury to Maine?
Yes, I would say it does, because of course whale watching is something that is very in, you might say, at the moment up in Maine, and I haven't been on one myself, but there again I would like to. And you know, one of the nice things about being a writer is you don't have to do these things. You can visualize what it would be like. You can live it in your imagination. You know, I rode that whale with poor Eustace there, and I don't have to go out and ride a whale. I know what it feels like. The interesting thing is that people will say so often to you how accurately you've described something which in fact you have never been involved with. For example, I have never been in an agricultural college. I know nothing about them, and consequently I have great scope to run balaclava exactly the way I like it. I don't know if you noticed that it sort of expands and contracts depending on what I'm writing about. But last night I was doing a signing over at your marvelous new mystery bookshop, right. Once Upon a Crime, and someone came up to me and told me how delighted she was that I had so very accurately described what it was like working in an agricultural college, which apparently this person does. And but you know, that's if you have learned your craft, and this is something people do not realize how hard writers work. We not only have to think things up, we have to have technique. We have to know things like grammar and spelling, and I think in my case, certainly, I've had a lifelong love affair with words for their own sake. I just love words, and I love punctuation. You know, I can go crazy over a semicolon, and but well, using your imagination as a tool, disciplining it to do what you want it to, as well as letting it have its head when it wants to go some new place that might provide you with a really exciting new plot or a new way of handling something or a new character. You really, it's like riding a horse maybe, that you have to, you know, in dressage, you have to teach them to do all these little things, but out in the field, if they're running a race, they've more or less got to run it according to their own pace. You really have to learn to handle your imagination as mm-hmm. well as your technique.
Well, we all know highly creative people about whom we may say they've never harnessed their energy, so to speak, and I imagine that's some of what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. People sometimes aren't successful, even if they're creative, because they haven't found a way to discipline that creativity. And on the other side, I'm sure it's true that people who are very disciplined maybe have not allowed themselves to be creative enough to be successful too.
That's true.
So it's a balance.
Yeah, and sometimes you get a writer who has beautiful technique but hasn't the spark, mm-hmm. Who perhaps does wonderful nonfiction but wouldn't be good at fiction or whatever. Mm-hmm. But that's a very, very good point that you've made. And of course, there is the discipline of the everyday writing too. Yes. I don't know how many people have said to me, I always wanted to write a book, but I never had the time. Nobody ever has the time. You have to make the time, and you have to make yourself do it.
Yes. We have people all the time coming to us and saying, I could have written that. Yeah. And our response is usually, but you didn't.
Exactly.
And therein lies that whole tale of sitting down to the typewriter every day.
And just lashing yourself to work.
Is it a typewriter for you? I read someplace that you do not use a word processor.
I do not use a word processor. As a matter of fact, I think Catriona McBogle made the point in Vain Pursuit that if God had wanted us to use word processors, she'd have given us styrene eyeballs, and I hold to that.
Have you ever tried it and not
I've
liked
tried
it?
it. Well, I just, the thing of it is, I learned, I never have learned to type properly, and this is true of many writers, but I have typed all my life, really, and when I went to work as a copywriter in advertising when I was very young, you simply had to produce typewritten copy, and there was just no way you could do it except to type. So I learned to compose on a typewriter, and that's what I've always done. And I've been doing it now for more years than I care to say, and I'm just not about to change. People have...
And apparently with good results, so...
Well, it's the way I do it.
Wonderful. You obviously do a lot of research that shows up in your books. For instance, herbs in drawing the character Miss Binks from Vain Pursuit, and antique cars in The Silver Ghost. As a librarian, it always appeals to me, the idea of doing research on a topic. Has that been a fun part of writing for you?
Well, of course, a lot of it has simply come out of this omnivorous reading that I've described, and my many little interests like puttering around the backyard and picking something up and thinking, what's that, and going to the flower book and looking it up. I love to look things up, and yes, and I have quite a little reference library of my own, as a matter of fact. But entre nous, much of my research is done by calling up my brother and asking him, because he knows practically everything, and if he doesn't, he can usually find out.
How convenient to be
Yes,
able to just call him up and say, do moonshine and alcohol produce
I don't think he'd answer
deadly
that
results?
well. No, it's things like boat engines and anything mechanical. I had an electric can opener once for a solid year before I figured out how to work it, and I'm still nonplussed by a pencil sharpener I got for Christmas. No, but as I said, well, for one thing, of course, you can carefully steer the conversation or the plot or whatever around to things that you do know, thus saving research. So my research is sporadic, but I will say that I am very, very grateful to interlibrary loan for some of it.
Wonderful, because you are a ways from a library, I would guess.
Well, the little farm the little farming town, I should say, that I live in does not have a library, but there are surprisingly good ones in some of the not very large communities nearby, and the librarians, of course, are always very gracious and very interested in helping you to track down information. In The Silver Ghost, for example, I used interlibrary loan to get information about the old cars, and of course I could go on about librarians for hours, but I'm sure you hear lots of nice things.
We'd like that, but I think people would rather hear more about authors than librarians. Part of the press release that I read said that a MacLeod mystery is always marked by sheer fun. But I noticed that contrasted with the humor of the books and the caustic remarks were very grisly murders sometimes. For instance, in The Corpse in Uzek's Pond, the man has his teeth pulled out by an amateur, and the old Buggins couple are murdered by a combination of moonshine and carbon tetrachloride.
Yes.
Somehow I expected, with the fun of the mysteries, that the murders would be less violent.
Well, some of them are not. Well, I mean, how can you have a less violent murder when you come right down to it? No matter how you do it, it's
kind of a nice murder.
Well, I know, but well, I guess maybe I'm down deep where it counts. I'm rotten.
What about the carbon tetrachloride and the alcohol? Is this something you researched, or did you hear someone at some point say that they made a deadly
No,
combination?
I researched that. I have a book on poisons that I use quite a lot, and wonderful reading, browsing through a book on poisons, you know, but I do that sort of thing. And no, well, I wouldn't advise anybody to try it. I will say that there have been times, especially with some of my earlier short stories, where I was rather careful not to tell the thing precisely the way it is. In other words, I made some deliberate errors because it would be it didn't seem to me that it was a very good idea to pass on this information.
Give an exact recipe
yes,
as to how you can do this on your own. Yes.
So I would say that anyone planning a murder should probably not rely on a mystery writer for guidance, because they may have a shred of conscience left and just not be giving proper information. In fact, Marion Babson, who's another mystery writer who's probably on your library shelves, told a story about a man who his wife was taking a bath, and he threw a plugged-in small radio into the bathtub because he had read a mystery where someone had been killed like this. The wife was very irate and got out of the bathtub and demanded to know why he'd done that, and instead of thinking up some plausible lie, he cowered in the corner saying, "It didn't work."
He blew his cover immediately.
He blew his cover along with a fuse, yes.
Oh, that's wonderful. Speaking of murder weapons, how do you decide on what to use, what would fit? Do you go back to your poison book? Or?
Well, it depends, yes. It depends on the ambience. Carbon tetrachloride, for example, is something that I can remember when I was a child was used as a cleaning agent before anybody realized how extremely deadly it was to have around. So it's something that might have been around an old house. Well, things that would be available in the country or in a suburban area, certain plants that might be in people's gardens or whatever, or a pitchfork or something. I've never used a pitchfork, but you know what I mean. It could be used.
A poison mushroom.
Something. Well, it would depend on the ambience again.
Has to fit the character.
It would fit the situation, and a city murder is different from a country murder. You let the crime fit the punishment, I guess, or whatever.
So you don't have a little 3x5 index file of various ways that murders can be committed in?
No, I don't. I rely on the inspiration of the moment to a large extent, or, as I said, on deciding what would be reasonable, and then sometimes I do check to make sure that it would be reasonable, depending.
Do you know the end of your mystery before you write it?
Yes, I do.
Do you start with the
actually
unraveling?
Well, what I do basically, once I've got my gathered little bits and pieces together and formed, worked out in my head some general idea of what the book might be about, I do know who is going to have done what at the end. And I write not an outline, but just a brief, rough synopsis to get myself going. And then as yes, I think you have to have some guidelines, because in order to plant your little clues and and also what I mentioned before about keeping your imagination on track, keeping it under control so that you don't go running off into byways. I forgot what else I was going to say, so.
The corpse in Uzek's Pond was nominated in 1987 for the Edgar Award. How important are awards for authors, or I should say, how important for you as an author have awards been in your career?
Well, that book also won the Nero Wolfe Award and the American Mystery Award, but I don't think my personal feeling is that awards have not, for one thing, some people feel it's slightly indecent to give an award to a humorous mystery, but I would say they have not been important. What has been important, basically, is the fact that people like one's books and that they tell their friends. Librarians may recommend, when somebody comes in and says, "I like Agatha Christie, but I read all her books, what else should I read?" And they say, "Oh, here, try Charlotte MacLeod." Or a mystery bookshop proprietor likes a book and tells her her customers about it. And then readers are missionaries, you know. They will tell their relatives, and they'll buy extra copies for presents and so on. I don't know how many books I've signed, Happy Birthday, Mother Dear, from some doting child who wants to be sure that his mother gets the latest bit of mayhem. And you know, it is wonderful how people do pass the word. And this, to me, is my award, is a satisfied reader.
I'm sure that is a better reward, indeed. I'm going to ask you a question that I'm sure everybody asks, but I'll risk it anyway. Why do you use a pseudonym for your Janet Wadman series?
Well, actually, I use it for my Grub and Stakers series, too,
right.
Which I don't think we've mentioned, but we don't have to get into that. Well, publishers have this thing about if they have a successful author who's selling well, they like to have that writer write more books. But they also have a mingy little rule that they don't want people to know this writer is writing more books, because that would make him prolific. And prolific, with some people, is a dirty word. So they asked him to use a pseudonym. I was very reluctant when they asked me, but then the thing of it is, I was born in Canada, but grew up in Massachusetts primarily, so that I always had this feeling of not quite belonging either place. And I thought, well, I could use a pseudonym and write Canadian-based books. Mm-hmm. And so I did that, and then all of a sudden I had an identity in both countries, and I have a very, both of me, so to speak, are much more comfortable. And also it does indicate to the reader which ambience it's going to be.
It is very convenient. I should mention, by the way, that your pseudonym is Alyssa Craig.
Yes.
And I did find that convenient. I knew that the Alyssa Craig books were going to be set in New Brunswick. And,
mm-hmm.
and by the way, I want to add that I think that setting in mysteries is very important to people. Often it adds a good deal of charm, as certainly is the case with the Alyssa Craig books. I love the New Brunswick setting. It's very different, very different feel from.
Well, also it is very restful, you might say, for me to be able to go from one identity to another. One of the problems in writing series characters, of course, people love to read series books, and I have always enjoyed them, because if you get fond of the characters and you want to see what happens next. But you could get, I think, very stale writing about the same ones all the time, or at least I could. And to go from one country to the other, it's like taking a vacation. It gives you a fresh outlook.
You've lived also in Sudbury, as you mentioned earlier, and the Sarah Kelling series is set there.
I'm sorry, the Sarah Kelling series is set primarily in Boston. And the suburbs such as Brookline and so on. I have lived in
Sudbury.
I've lived in the greater Boston area most of my life. When my parents came from Canada, they came to Boston, and we lived there for a while. And when later on, when I grew up, I lived in Boston on Beacon Hill, and of course absorbed a great deal of the local color there, and in the Back Bay. And so these are settings, all these settings are places of which I have had experience in my own life.
So that, it seems, I had the feeling that it was important to you to set your books in a place you were familiar with and comfortable with.
Well, it saves, actually, I've completely made up Balaclava County, so I'm very comfortable there because nobody lives there but me. And yes, it saves a lot of research, for one thing. You can just not sweat the small stuff and go ahead and write the book.
And no one can say you're wrong about Balaclava County.
They certainly can't.
Or that they've lived there and they know that's not so.
Some people have tried.
I'm sure. Well, I wanted to sneak in a couple of extra questions, but time, the ultimate mystery, has caught up with us, and we've run out. But I do want to say that I've enjoyed your mysteries, all of them, all of the series, and I hope that our readers who have not read will join me and become familiar and enjoy your mysteries. And I'm looking forward to mysteries that I know you will continue to write. It will be fun. One of the fun parts about your mysteries is seeing the growth of the characters, and I always want to know more about them. So thank you for being with us today.
Well, I hope I'll continue to please you, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.